Welcome, and tonight we travel back more than 200 years to the quiet streets of Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia. The sun has long disappeared beyond the horizon. The last traces of daylight fade from the sky, and a gentle darkness settles over the town. Most families have finished their evening meals. Candles flicker softly behind small windows. Doors are locked, shutters are closed, and the town slowly drifts into sleep. On a narrow cobblestone street, a solitary figure begins his nightly journey. His name is Thomas Carter, the town's night watchman. In one hand, he carries a lantern whose warm golden light dances across the stones beneath his feet. In the other, he holds a sturdy wooden staff, worn smooth from years of use. The night air is cool and calm. A soft breeze moves through the tall trees that line the streets. Their leaves whisper quietly in the darkness. Thomas walks slowly and steadily. His footsteps echo gently through the silent town. Unlike modern cities filled with electric lights and the sounds of traffic, Colonial Williamsburg is remarkably peaceful after sunset. There are no engines, no glowing signs, and no distant sirens, only silence, and the occasional sound of nature. Far away, an owl calls from the forest. A horse shifts quietly inside a nearby stable. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once before settling down again. Thomas pauses near the town square. The large brick buildings stand quietly beneath the moonlight. Shadows stretch across the ground. He raises his lantern and carefully surveys the area. Everything appears calm. Everything appears safe. Satisfied, he continues his journey. As he walks, he notices a faint glow coming from the bakery. Inside, the baker has already begun preparing tomorrow's bread. The scent of fresh dough drifts gently into the cool night air. Thomas smiles. The baker starts work while most of the town sleeps. Soon enough, families will wake to warm loaves of bread waiting for them. For now, however, the streets remain quiet. The night watchman continues his slow patrol.
Town. The lantern in his hand swayed gently with each step, casting warm circles of golden light across the cobblestones. Above him, the moon hung quietly in the sky, bathing Williamsburg in soft silver light. Most homes were dark now. Families rested beneath handmade quilts. Children slept peacefully after long days of chores, lessons, and play. The town seemed frozen in time. Thomas enjoyed these quiet hours. During the day, Williamsburg was busy with merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and travelers. Wagons rolled through the streets. Horses carried riders from one destination to another. But at night, everything changed. The town became calm, peaceful, almost magical. As Thomas passed a small wooden house, he noticed a single candle still burning in an upstairs window. Perhaps someone was reading a book. Perhaps a mother was caring for a sleeping child. Or perhaps an elderly resident simply could not sleep. Whatever the reason, the small light glowed warmly against the darkness. Thomas smiled and continued walking. The cool Virginia breeze carried the scent of pine trees from the nearby woods. Leaves rustled softly overhead. The sound reminded him of waves gently washing onto a distant shore. Far beyond the town, forests stretched across the landscape. At night, those forests came alive. Owls hunted silently among the trees. Foxes moved through the undergrowth. Crickets filled the darkness with their endless songs. Thomas often listened to these sounds during his patrol. To him, they were the music of the night.
The blacksmith's final fire. A little farther down the street stood the town blacksmith's workshop. Earlier in the day, the forge had been filled with activity. The blacksmith had repaired wagon wheels, shaped horseshoes, and crafted metal tools for local farmers. Now, however, the workshop was nearly silent. Through the open doorway, Thomas could see the final glowing embers inside the forge.
Their orange light flickered softly in the darkness. The blacksmith had already gone home. Only the dying fire remained. Thomas paused for a moment. The warm glow reminded him of countless evenings spent watching craftsmen complete their work before returning to their families. Life in colonial America was not easy. Everything required hard work. Yet there was a certain simplicity to it. People built things with their hands, they knew their neighbors, they lived close to nature, and every night they welcomed rest after a long day of labor. Thomas continued onward. The streets remained peaceful, exactly as they should be.
The church bell. Near the center of town stood Williamsburg's church. Its tall steeple rose into the moonlit sky. Thomas approached the building slowly. The church had stood for many years. Generations of families had gathered there for weddings, baptisms, celebrations, and prayers. Tonight, it stood silent. Suddenly, the church bell rang once. A deep, gentle sound echoed across the sleeping town. The sound drifted through the quiet streets, across rooftops, across gardens, across fields. Then silence returned. Thomas listened carefully. He always enjoyed hearing the bell at night. It reminded him that time continued moving forward, even while the town slept. The bell's echo slowly faded into the darkness. The night remained calm, peaceful, unhurried.
Midnight over Williamsburg. Midnight had arrived. The town slept deeply now. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon. Shadows shifted along the empty streets. Thomas walked toward the edge of town, where open fields stretched into the distance. Here, the night felt even quieter. The stars sparkled brilliantly overhead. Without modern lights, the sky appeared endless. Thousands upon thousands of stars filled the darkness. Thomas often paused here to admire them. He wondered how many generations before him had looked upon these same stars. Farmers, sailors, travelers, dreamers. For a few peaceful moments, he stood still beneath the vast night sky. The cool air felt refreshing. The world felt calm. And all was well. The stable at the edge of town. Thomas continued his quiet patrol toward the edge of Williamsburg. There, beside a narrow dirt road, stood a wooden stable. The building was old but sturdy. Inside, several horses rested peacefully after a long day of work. Thomas opened the stable door carefully. The hinges creaked softly. A gentle scent of hay filled the air. Moonlight streamed through small gaps in the wooden walls, creating silver patterns across the floor. One horse lifted its head and looked toward the watchman. Thomas smiled. "Easy now," he whispered. The horse seemed content. After a moment, it lowered its head once more and returned to rest. The stable was warm and quiet. The slow breathing of the animals created a peaceful rhythm. Thomas stood silently for a moment, listening. In a busy world, few sounds were more calming than the gentle breathing of sleeping horses. Satisfied that all was well, he quietly closed the door and continued his journey. Before the lights go out. The world that existed before electric America. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world with no electric lights. No street lamps casting orange glow on wet pavement. No glowing signs above storefronts. No headlights sweeping around corners. No blue light from a phone screen beside your bed. Just darkness. Real darkness. The kind that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. The kind where, on a cloudy night, you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. This was the world that most Americans lived in for the first century and a half of this nation's existence. And somewhere in the middle of that world, in the colony of Virginia, in a small but remarkably important city built on red clay soil and revolutionary ideas, a man named Thomas Carter picked up his lantern every night, stepped out into that darkness and went to work.
His job had a simple name, night watchman. But his role in the life of his city was anything but simple. Tonight, we travel back to that world, to Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, to the streets, the homes, the shops, the taverns, the churches, and the lives of the people who built the foundation of what would become the United States of America. This is not just a story about one man walking through the dark. This is the story of an entire civilization, its rhythms, its struggles, its sounds, its smells, its fears, and its remarkable beauty, told through the hours of a single night. Come with us now. The sun has just set over Virginia, and the night is just beginning. To understand Colonial Williamsburg, you first have to understand what it meant to live without time as we know it. In the 21st century, we measure our days in minutes and seconds. Alarms wake us at precise moments. Schedules fill our phones. We know, almost to the second, exactly where we are supposed to be and when. Colonial Americans measured time differently. They measured it by light. When the sun rose, the day began. When the sun set, the day ended. The length of a day changed with the seasons. Long, golden summer days that stretched past 9 in the evening, and short, bitter winter days that plunged into darkness by 4 in the afternoon. There were no alarm clocks in colonial Virginia. There were roosters. There were church bells. There were the natural rhythms of the body, which, without artificial light to disrupt them, fell into patterns of sleep and waking that modern scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Colonial people often slept in 2 separate phases, what historians call first sleep and second sleep. They would go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for several hours, wake naturally around midnight, spend an hour or 2 reading by candlelight, praying, talking quietly, or simply lying in the darkness thinking, and then drift back into a second, deeper sleep before the dawn. This was not considered strange. This was simply how nights worked. And into that nighttime world, that vast, quiet, carefully structured darkness, Thomas Carter walked every single night with his lantern held high. How Williamsburg came to be and why it mattered. Before we can understand the night watchman, we have to understand the city he watched over. Williamsburg, Virginia, sits on a narrow strip of land between 2 rivers, the York to the north, the James to the south. It is a peninsula cradled by water on nearly every side, and it was this geography that first drew European settlers to the region in the early 1600s. The English established their first permanent settlement in the Americas just a few miles away, at Jamestown, in 1607. Those early years were catastrophic. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy that had lived on this land for generations. Of the 500 colonists who arrived at Jamestown in the fall of 1609, fewer than 60 were still alive the following spring. This was the brutal reality of early colonial life. But the survivors persisted. They adapted. They built. And slowly, over the decades that followed, the colony of Virginia began to take shape. By the late 1600s, Jamestown was struggling. The marshy, mosquito-ridden land made it prone to disease. A devastating fire in 1698 destroyed the State House for the second time, and colonial leaders seized the opportunity to start fresh. They moved the colonial capital 8 miles inland, to a small settlement that had grown up around a college founded in Finden-Amby III, the College of William and Mary, the second oldest college in America, still operating today. They called the new capital Williamsburg, in honor of the reigning English king, William III. And they built it deliberately, planned, organized, intentional. At a time when most colonial settlements grew organically, haphazardly,
Following whatever paths livestock had first carved through the wilderness, Williamsburg was designed on paper before a single building went up. The main road, Duke of Gloucester Street, ran nearly a mile from the College of William and Mary at one end to the Capitol building at the other. It was exactly 99 feet wide, extraordinarily broad for the time, and lined with the homes, shops, taverns, and public buildings that would define the city's character for the next century. The Palace Green ran perpendicular to the main street, leading north to the Governor's Palace, a grand brick mansion that housed the royal governors who represented the British Crown in Virginia, and later the first two American governors of the new Commonwealth. In between these anchor points, the city filled in organically over the years. Craftsmen set up their shops, merchants built their stores, lawyers established their offices near the courthouse, churches claimed their corners. By the middle of the 18th century, Williamsburg was the political, cultural, and intellectual center of the most populous and powerful of Britain's American colonies. And it was here, on these planned streets, in these carefully constructed buildings, that some of the most important conversations in American history took place.
The names associated with Colonial Williamsburg read like a roster of the American founding. George Washington walked these streets regularly, riding in from his plantation at Mount Vernon to attend meetings of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature that met in the Capitol building at the eastern end of Duke of Gloucester Street. Thomas Jefferson studied at the College of William and Mary, dined at the Raleigh Tavern, argued philosophy with his professor George Wythe, and first began developing the ideas about liberty and self-governance that would eventually find their way into the Declaration of Independence. Patrick Henry stood in the House of Burgesses and delivered some of the most electrifying speeches in pre-revolutionary American history, speeches that pushed his colleagues toward positions they were not yet sure they were ready to take. George Mason, the brilliant but often overlooked Virginia planter, developed the concept of individual rights that would ultimately shape the Bill of Rights. And it was here, in Williamsburg, that Virginia's colonial leaders first began the slow, painful, exhilarating process of imagining a world without British rule. But here is what the history books too often forget. None of those famous men could have done any of that without the hundreds of ordinary people who kept the city running around them. The blacksmiths who shod their horses, the millers who ground their grain, the coopers who made their barrels, the tavern keepers who poured their cider, the seamstresses who made their clothes, the enslaved men and women whose unpaid labor built the buildings, cooked the food, cleaned the houses, and made the entire economy of colonial Virginia possible. And yes, the night watchmen who kept the streets safe while everyone else slept. These are their stories too.
Evening life in a colonial city. Let us go back to that evening. The sun has set. Thomas Carter is just beginning his patrol. But before we follow him into the night, let us look back at what the day looked like. Because to understand the night, you have to understand the world that created it. Colonial Williamsburg was, at its peak, home to approximately 2,000 people. That number swelled dramatically when the colonial legislature was in session, a period called the Public Times, when planters, lawyers, merchants, and politicians flooded in from across the colony, doubling or tripling the city's population virtually overnight. During those periods, Williamsburg was electric with activity. By day, Duke of Gloucester Street was a river of humanity. Horses and carriages moved through the wide street. Merchants called to passers-by from their storefronts. Apprentices ran errands between buildings. Children chased dogs through gaps in the crowds. The smells of bread from the bakery, leather from the harness maker, and wood smoke from a dozen different hearths all mingled together in the open air. The sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge. The rhythmic thump of a loom carried from an open window. A printer's press groaned and clattered in a small shop near the Capitol, producing the Virginia Gazette, the colony's newspaper, one of the most important publications in pre-revolutionary America. This was a city fully alive. And then, as the afternoon light began to soften and the shadows grew long, the rhythms changed. Shops began to close. Apprentices cleaned their tools and put them away. Merchants tallied their accounts for the day. Horses were led back to stables, brushed down, watered, and fed. Families returned to their homes.
In the homes of Colonial Williamsburg, the evening meal was the central social event of the day. Unlike modern Americans, who often eat the largest meal of the day at dinner, colonial Virginians typically ate their largest meal in the middle of the day, what they called dinner. The evening meal, called supper, was lighter, simpler, more intimate. Families gathered around a table lit by candles or the glow of a fireplace. Food was served family style, large communal dishes placed at the center of the table, from which everyone helped themselves. There might be cold meats left over from dinner, fresh bread, cheese, preserves, root vegetables, perhaps a simple soup or stew. In the homes of wealthy planters and merchants, supper might be more elaborate, multiple courses served on fine china imported from England, accompanied by wine or Madeira, followed by desserts of puddings and preserved fruits. In the homes of craftsmen and tradespeople, supper was humbler. Whatever was practical, whatever was available, whatever could be prepared quickly at the end of a long workday. And in the quarters behind the main houses, in the small, cramped structures where enslaved people lived, supper was whatever had been allowed, whatever could be cooked on a small hearth, eaten quickly before the day's exhaustion finally claimed everyone. This was the reality of colonial life. It was not a world of equals. It was a world of profound and often brutal inequality, a world where some people owned other people, where indentured servants worked for years to pay off the cost of their passage from England, where women had virtually no legal rights of their own, where children worked alongside adults almost from the time they could walk. Understanding Colonial Williamsburg means understanding all of this, not just the grand buildings and the famous speeches, but the full, complicated, often painful truth of daily life.
As supper wound down in the private homes of Williamsburg, a different kind of evening life was just getting started in the city's taverns. Colonial taverns, or ordinaries as they were often called in Virginia, were not just places to drink. They were the social hubs of the entire community. In an age before telephones, before newspapers appeared more than once a week, before any of the communication infrastructure we take entirely for granted today, the tavern was where you found out what was happening in the world. You heard the latest news from London. You learned about trouble brewing in the northern colonies. You picked up gossip about which planter was in debt, which merchant had received a new shipment of goods, which politician had said something controversial in the House of Burgesses that afternoon. You conducted business. You negotiated deals. You shook hands over agreements that had the force of law in a community where everyone knew everyone, and your word was your bond. The Raleigh Tavern on Duke of Gloucester Street was perhaps the most famous of Williamsburg's taverns. It was here that Virginia's colonial leaders sometimes met when they were barred from the Capitol building, as happened in 1769 when Governor Boudetort dissolved the House of Burgesses in response to their resolves against British taxation, and the Burgesses simply walked down the street to the Raleigh and kept meeting anyway. It was an act of quiet defiance that carried enormous weight. The Apollo Room of the Raleigh Tavern hosted dances, banquets, auctions, and political meetings. Above its mantelpiece hung a Latin motto that many historians believe influenced the thinking of Virginia's revolutionary generation: Hilarata sapientiae et bone vitae proles. Joy is the offspring of wisdom and good living. On a typical evening, the tavern would be warm with firelight and loud with conversation. Card games were played at corner tables, backgammon boards were set up near the fire, pipes were smoked, debates ranged from the practical to the philosophical. And eventually, one by one, the patrons would finish their drinks, wrap their coats around themselves, step out into the cool night air, and make their way home through the dark streets, where Thomas Carter would be waiting.
Who were the night watchmen of colonial America? Thomas Carter is a composite figure, a man constructed from the records of dozens of real night watchmen who served in colonial Virginia towns during the 18th century. His name appears in no famous document. Thomas Carter carries two essential tools on his nightly patrol. The first is his lantern. In the 18th century, a lantern was not a simple object. It was a carefully constructed device, typically a metal frame with panels of horn or glass, designed to protect a candle flame from the wind while allowing its light to illuminate the surrounding area. The candles used in colonial lanterns were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or from bayberry wax, which was more expensive but burned more cleanly and produced a pleasant scent. Beeswax candles were the most desirable of all, but also the most costly, and were generally reserved for the homes of the wealthy. A single tallow candle cast a circle of warm, slightly flickering light, perhaps 6 to 8 feet in diameter. Beyond that circle, the darkness was nearly absolute. This meant that Thomas Carter's world, as he walked his patrol, was a world of moving islands of light, a golden circle that traveled with him through the darkness, illuminating a few feet of street and then leaving it again in shadow as he moved on. The second tool is his staff. A sturdy pole of hardwood, perhaps 4 or 5 feet long, worn smooth with use. The staff served multiple purposes. It helped him navigate uneven ground in the dark, it could be used to pound on a door and alert residents to danger, and it provided a measure of personal protection in an era when street crime, while not rampant, was a genuine reality. Some night watchmen also carried a rattle, a wooden device that could be spun to produce a loud clacking sound, used to raise an alarm when the watchman needed help quickly or needed to alert the neighborhood to a fire.
The architecture of daily life, the buildings of Williamsburg, and what they tell us. As Thomas Carter walks his patrol, the buildings he passes are not merely background scenery. Each one tells a story. Each one represents a set of choices about materials, about craft, about aspiration, about the values of the people who built it and the society that produced them. Let us look at some of those buildings now. The Capitol building at the eastern end of Duke of Gloucester Street is perhaps the most politically significant building in colonial America. Built between 1701 and 1705, it was a bold architectural statement, a large H-shaped brick structure with a distinctive rounded apse at one end, designed to house both branches of Virginia's colonial legislature. The House of Burgesses met in one wing, the Governor's Council met in the other, and in the central building connecting them, the General Court heard the most serious legal cases in the colony. This was where Virginia's most fundamental decisions were made. This was where Patrick Henry stood in May of 1765 and introduced his resolves against the Stamp Act, the British Parliament's attempt to tax the American colonies directly for the first time. His speech was so radical, so confrontational, that some of his fellow burgesses reportedly shouted treason in response. Henry's reply is one of the most famous in American political history. "If this be treason," he reportedly said, "make the most of it." The Capitol burned in 1747. It was rebuilt. It burned again, or was demolished, historians are not entirely certain, after the Capitol moved to Richmond in 1780. The building that stands in Colonial Williamsburg today is a careful reconstruction, completed in 1934, based on extensive historical research. Moving west along Duke of Gloucester Street, Thomas Carter passes the courthouse. The courthouse was the center of local government, the place where the local court met, where disputes between neighbors were settled, where contracts were recorded, where wills were probated, where petty criminals faced justice, and where the business of ordinary civic life was conducted. Colonial courthouses were not intimidating temples of marble and granite. They were human-scaled brick buildings, functional rather than monumental, designed to be the kind of place where ordinary people could walk in off the street and have their concerns heard. Justice in colonial Virginia was swift by modern standards. Cases were often heard and decided on the same day they were brought.
There were no professional lawyers in the modern sense. Men trained themselves in the law by reading Blackstone's commentaries and other legal texts, argued their own cases and each other's, and gradually developed the expertise that would eventually qualify them to be called attorneys. Thomas Jefferson read law under the supervision of George Wythe here in Williamsburg, studying for 5 years in Wythe's office before being admitted to practice. It was an education that shaped his entire subsequent career. The courthouse also served another, darker function. It was here or near here that punishments were publicly administered. The pillory, the stocks, public flogging. These were not merely punishments, they were performances designed to be witnessed by the community. Shame was a powerful social tool in colonial Virginia, and making punishment visible was part of its purpose. The brutality of the colonial justice system is something we cannot honestly overlook. Further along his route, Thomas Carter passes Bruton Parish Church. The church is the oldest continuous-use Anglican church building in the United States. Its origins go back to 1674, though the current structure was built between 1711 and 1715. Its tower, added in 1769, became one of the most recognizable landmarks in the colonial capital. For the people of Colonial Williamsburg, the church was not merely a place of weekly worship. It was the center of social, moral, and civic life. In a world without social services, without government assistance programs, without hospitals in the modern sense, the church provided what safety net existed. It organized care for the poor, the sick, and the orphaned. It educated children in the fundamentals of reading and Christian doctrine. It marked the passages of life, baptism, marriage, burial, that gave individual existence its social meaning. Church attendance was not merely encouraged in colonial Virginia, it was, for much of the colonial period, legally required. The Virginia colony's laws mandated Sunday attendance at the Church of England, though enforcement varied considerably by time and place. Dissenters, Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists, and others who did not conform to the established church were tolerated with varying degrees of grudging acceptance, particularly as the 18th century progressed and religious diversity in the colony grew. By the time of the Revolution, Virginia had developed a notably complex relationship with religious establishment. The very men who sat in Williamsburg's House of Burgesses and argued for political liberty would soon grapple with the question of religious liberty, with the eventual result being Virginia's Statute for Religious Freedom, drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1777 and passed by the state legislature in 1786. It was one of the most important documents in the history of American freedom. And its intellectual roots were here, in this city, in the conversations and debates that filled the halls of the Capitol, the rooms of the Raleigh Tavern, and the pews of Bruton Parish Church. The people behind the history. Ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. The famous men of Colonial Williamsburg, Washington, Jefferson, Henry, Mason, were real, and their contributions to American history were genuinely extraordinary. But they were not the only people who mattered. Let us spend some time with the others. Consider the blacksmith. His shop sits on a side street off the main thoroughfare. He has been at work since before dawn. The forge needs hours to reach working temperature, and the day's orders are substantial. Horseshoes for the governor's stable, nails for a new building going up near the Capitol, hardware for a merchant's warehouse down by the river. The blacksmith's craft is one of the most physically demanding in the colonial world. Standing over a forge that burns at over 2,000 degrees, wielding a hammer that weighs several pounds, shaping metal that glows orange with heat,
It is work that builds enormous physical strength and demands precise skill. A good blacksmith is one of the most valued members of any colonial community. He works with one or two apprentices, young men, often teenagers, who have been bound to him for a term of years to learn the trade. In exchange for their labor, he provides them with food, housing, clothing, and the invaluable education of a skilled craft. At the end of their apprenticeship, they will be able to set up their own shops and support themselves and their families through a lifetime of skilled work. This was the colonial economy's primary mechanism for transferring knowledge from one generation to the next. It was a system with real advantages, a genuine commitment to skill, craft, and the patient transmission of expertise. And it had real flaws. It was largely closed to women, to enslaved people, and to those who could not secure an apprenticeship placement, which often depended on family connections and social standing. Consider the milliner. Her shop is one of the most visited in Colonial Williamsburg, not by historians or tourists, but by the women of the city itself, who come to her for hats, gloves, fans, ribbons, laces, and the other accessories that were essential to feminine dress in the 18th century. The milliner was one of the few business occupations that colonial society generally accepted as appropriate for women. This was not out of any progressive attitude toward female independence. It was because millinery was considered a female domain, a business that dealt in feminine goods, and therefore, by the logic of the era, naturally belonged to women. Some milliners in Colonial Williamsburg were extraordinarily successful businesswomen. They imported goods directly from London. They maintained extensive correspondence with suppliers and customers. They managed their own accounts, negotiated their own contracts, and built genuine wealth. And yet they did all of this within a legal and social framework that treated them, in most respects, as dependent beings. A married woman in colonial Virginia had virtually no separate legal identity. Her property became her husband's property upon marriage, and she could not sign contracts, sue in court, or conduct business in her own name without her husband's authorization. The exception was widows, who regained legal personhood upon the deaths of their husbands, and thereafter operate businesses, own property, and manage their own affairs. It was a deeply unjust system, and yet within it, women found ways to exercise real agency, real intelligence, and real power. Consider the baker. He is the man Thomas Carter notices as he passes the bakery on his nightly patrol, the one whose windows glow with warm light in the middle of the night, whose chimney sends the scent of fresh bread drifting into the cool darkness. The baker's life is organized entirely around the rhythms of his product. Bread takes time. The dough must be mixed and kneaded. It must rise, a process that takes hours and that proceeds at a pace determined entirely by temperature and humidity and the mysterious alchemy of yeast. The ovens must be heated to the right temperature and maintained there. The loaves must be shaped, proofed again, and finally baked at precisely the right moment. If the baker sleeps when other people sleep, his bread will not be ready when the city wakes up, so he doesn't sleep when other people sleep. He wakes at midnight, or 2 in the morning, or whenever the rhythm of his work demands. He stokes his fire, he shapes his loaves, he tends his oven with the practiced attention of a craftsman who has been doing this for 20 years and knows by instinct and experience exactly what the bread needs and when. By the time Williamsburg wakes up at dawn, the baker's work is largely done. Fresh loaves sit on his counter, their crusts golden, their interiors soft and steaming. The smells that drift out his open door are the smells of comfort, of nourishment, of a city that is fed and cared for. It is, in its own way, a beautiful thing. The weight of bondage. Slavery in Colonial Williamsburg. We cannot tell the full story of Colonial Williamsburg without telling this story. At the time of the Revolution, approximately half of Virginia's population was enslaved. Half. The men who walked these streets and debated liberty and self-governance owned other human beings. The grand houses of Williamsburg were built by enslaved labor. The food served in the governor's palace was cooked by enslaved hands. The fields that produced the tobacco that funded the entire colonial economy were worked by men and women who received nothing for their labor. Not wages, not freedom, not recognition, not even the legal right to exist as persons rather than property. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is an essential one. The story of Colonial Williamsburg is incomplete, is dishonest without it. The enslaved people of Williamsburg lived in the spaces behind the main houses. In small, often crowded structures that stood in stark contrast to the comfortable homes of their owners. They worked from before dawn until after dark. They cooked, cleaned, built, repaired, sewed, drove carriages, cared for children, tended gardens, and performed virtually every form of labor that the colonial economy required. And they were legally invisible. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not own property. They could not learn to read in many circumstances. Teaching an enslaved person to read was actually illegal in parts of colonial Virginia. They could not marry legally, though they formed families and relationships of deep love and commitment in spite of everything. They could not, after dark, move freely through the streets that Thomas Carter patrolled. The night watch in colonial cities was explicitly empowered to stop and question any black person, free or enslaved, found on the streets after dark without written permission from a white employer or guardian. This was not an accidental feature of the system. It was intentional. It was enforced. It was part of the architecture of control that kept the institution of slavery functioning in a society that claimed, even then, to believe in human freedom. The contradiction was not lost on everyone. There were voices, even in the 18th century, that pointed to the moral absurdity of men who called for liberty while owning human beings. John Adams noted it. Samuel Johnson mocked it from London. And in the debates leading up to the Revolution, the contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore. Some of Virginia's founders struggled with it genuinely. Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, owned more than 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime. Washington freed his enslaved people in his will only after his death, and only the ones he personally owned, rather than those belonging to his wife's estate. These were not men of simple villainy. They were men of profound contradiction, capable of extraordinary moral vision and breathtaking moral failure, sometimes simultaneously. Understanding them fully, understanding this city and this era fully, requires holding both truths at once. The hours after midnight. What the darkness revealed. It is past midnight now. The taverns have closed. The last of the evening's drinkers and debaters have made their way home through the dark streets. The baker is at his oven. The city sleeps. Thomas Carter continues his patrol. This is the quietest hour. The hour when the night feels most complete, most total.
The sounds of the city have subsided to almost nothing, just the wind, the insects, the occasional animal sound, the distant bark of a dog settling back into sleep. And yet, the night is not entirely still. In the slave quarters behind the main houses, there is sometimes quiet activity. A child who cannot sleep, a mother sitting up, rocking, singing softly, an old man whose bones ache too much for easy rest, sitting by a banked fire, perhaps praying, perhaps simply thinking of a home that exists only in memory. In the craftsmen's houses, here and there, a candle still burns. A glassblower working on a challenging piece by firelight. A surveyor checking his calculations by the flame of a single tallow candle. A student, perhaps a young William and Mary student, the ink still wet on his notes from a day of lectures, reading until his eyes finally give out. The night has its own community, its own population, its own rhythms. Thomas Carter knows all of this. He has walked these streets for years. He knows which windows are always dark by 9. He knows which chimneys still smoke past midnight. He knows the patterns of his city, the way a musician knows a piece of music they have played 1,000 times, not consciously, not by reading from a score, but in the body, in the blood, as something so deeply familiar that its variations stand out immediately, obviously, unmistakably. Something is wrong tonight.
The approach of dawn. The night gives way. The fire is out. Neighbors drift back to their homes, talking quietly, relieved. A few men stay behind to make sure the embers are fully cold, to assess the damage in the growing darkness, to plan what repairs will be needed. Thomas Carter checks every visible corner of the building one more time. Satisfied that the danger has passed, he resumes his patrol. The sky to the east is still completely dark, but something has changed in the quality of the darkness. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible to anyone who hasn't spent as many nights outside as Thomas Carter has. The darkness is no longer quite as total as it was at midnight. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the first faint suggestion of change is beginning. Dawn is coming. It is still hours away, but it is coming.
The first bird calls at around 4 in the morning. A single note, tentative and questioning, from somewhere in the tall trees that line the streets of Williamsburg. Then silence. Then another call from a different direction. And slowly, as if in response to some signal that humans cannot hear, the woods around the town begin to come alive with sound. First a few voices, then more again, until by 4:30 the air is filled with birdsong, a complex, layered, constantly shifting symphony of sound that builds and builds as the first pale grayness begins to touch the eastern sky. The colonial world paid close attention to birdsong. In a world without clocks in every room, without phones on every nightstand, without electric lights to override the body's natural rhythms, the sounds and light of the natural world served as the primary timekeepers. The roosters in the stable yards of Williamsburg would soon add their voices to the chorus, the sound that more than any other announced to the sleeping city that the night was ending and the day was about to begin. For Thomas Carter, the building birdsong is a welcome sound. Not because he is afraid of the dark, he has made his peace with darkness long ago, but because it means his work is almost done.
There it is. From somewhere behind the main street, a rooster announces the dawn with the confident authority of an animal that has done this every morning of its life, and will continue doing it without fail until the day it dies. The sound seems to release something in the city. A few windows light up. A door opens. Someone steps outside, looks at the sky, makes some assessment of the day's weather, and goes back in. The baker, who has been at his work since midnight, opens his front shutters for the first time. The warm, golden light of his oven spills out into the pre-dawn street, accompanied by the smell of bread that has been cooling for the past 2 hours, ready for the first customers of the day. A cart appears at the far end of Duke of Gloucester Street, its wooden wheels rumbling on the cobblestones, a man driving it toward the market area with a load of vegetables from his farm outside of town. The day has not yet fully begun, but it is beginning, and Thomas Carter is nearly home.
Morning, and what it means. The legacy of a city that built a nation. Thomas Carter arrives home as the sky lightens from gray to pale gold. He sets his lantern on the table. He hangs his staff by the door. He sits for a moment at the kitchen table, tired, but with the particular satisfaction of a night's work completed, of a city delivered safely through the darkness to the light of a new day. His wife is already awake. She sets a cup of small beer on the table before him, a low-alcohol beverage that was the standard morning drink in colonial households, because water from wells and rivers was often unsafe. She puts bread on the table, the same bread from the baker down the street. They sit together in the early morning quiet. Outside, the city is waking up.
In the more than 250 years since Thomas Carter walked his patrol through the streets of Colonial Williamsburg, the world has changed beyond anything he could have imagined. The country he helped protect in its infancy has grown to be a nation of more than 300 million people, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and beyond. The city he patrolled by lantern light is now illuminated at night by electric lights that would have seemed miraculous to him. Lights that require no candles, no oil, no tending, that switch on and off at the touch of a finger and cast more light than 1,000 colonial lanterns combined. The political ideas that were debated in the taverns and assembly halls of his city, ideas about liberty, about self-governance, about the rights of individuals against the power of governments, have echoed through those 2 centuries of American history and spread to influence governments and movements across the globe. The contradictions that existed in that city, the freedom and the bondage, the idealism and the brutal reality, the soaring rhetoric and the everyday injustice have echoed through those same 2 centuries, unresolved, contested, sometimes progressing and sometimes regressing, but never fully resolved. We are still, as a nation, living with the legacies of Colonial Williamsburg, the legacies of its brilliance and its failures alike. Colonial Williamsburg today exists as a living museum, a remarkable effort to preserve, reconstruct, and interpret the physical and human world of 18th century Virginia. The restoration of the historic district began in earnest in the 1920s, funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who poured what would be hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money into the project over the following decades. Today, more than 80 original 18th century buildings still stand in the historic district, alongside hundreds of carefully researched reconstructions. But the most important work being done in Colonial Williamsburg today is not architectural. It is interpretive. For decades, the story told in Williamsburg was an incomplete one, focused on the famous men and their famous ideas, while leaving the lives of enslaved people, women, craftswomen who ran businesses in face of legal obstacles, the stories of the indentured servants and the free black community, and the indigenous peoples of the region. It is still an incomplete process, but it is the right direction. Because the truest, most honest, most useful history is the history that doesn't choose, that doesn't tell only the uplifting parts or only the painful parts, but holds it all together and asks us to reckon with the full complexity of who we are and where we came from. The lantern still burns. What we carry forward. Thomas Carter walked his patrol tonight, as he did every night. He lit his lantern, he picked up his staff, he stepped out into the darkness and began to move through the silent streets of his city. He checked the Capitol, he checked the courthouse, he checked the church, he checked the taverns, the shops, the stables, the bakery. He called the alarm when he smelled smoke, and his neighbors came running. He kept watch over sleeping families who never thought about him. He protected a city that would go on to play a central role in the birth of a nation. And as the sun rose over Colonial Williamsburg on another Virginia morning, he went home. He ate his bread, he drank his small beer, and he slept. This is what history is made of. Not only the grand speeches, not only the famous names, not only the documents signed and the battles won and the monuments built. History is made of ordinary people doing necessary work in the dark. People who showed up, who kept watch, who kept faith with their communities even when the night was cold and the work was hard and no one was watching them in return. There are Thomas Carters among us still. There have always been. And in every generation, the question that Colonial Williamsburg puts before us is the same question that Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Washington were wrestling with, however imperfectly, 250 years ago. What does it mean to build a community worth protecting? What does it mean to keep watch over one another? What does it mean to be, in the most fundamental sense, citizens of a shared city, responsible to one another, accountable to one another, committed to one another's safety and well-being, even when it costs us something? These are not historical questions. They are the questions of every generation. They are our questions right now, tonight. And somewhere in the lessons of Colonial Williamsburg, in its brilliance and its failures, its idealism and its injustice, its famous men and its forgotten ones, the answers are waiting to be found. The lantern is still burning. The night is long, and there is work to be done.